So my name is Raresh. I'm a senior environment artist working at AMC Studios here in Bucharest. And today I'm going to talk to you about what it is to be a 3D artist. And I'll be addressing some of the times when life as a 3D artist it's not so much fun. But ironically, this is the time when you kind of learn the most. You kind of have these small revelations when you're facing a lot of difficult issues. So I'll be illustrating these facts by telling you some stories through some of the projects that I worked on. And so, Entropia Universe, this was a really cool project we worked on about, I think, 9 or 8 years ago. This was an MMO, a sci-fi game. And this was very special as a project because it was the first time where we got to see like a full visual pipeline of a project, in the sense that we got to do concept work. You can see here some of the concepts that we did for them. We did level design, we did some spaceships, some robots, and we even dealt with in-engine integration, which was in UDK 2, I think, a while back. You can see some of the 3D assets over here that we built. And I think these are the in-game stuff. So usually when you're working in outsourcing, you kind of get just the 3D part of a game. You don't really get the concept. The clients usually like to keep that part because they like a lot of control for the overall look of a game. And the in-engine, they also do in-house. These are in-engine images right now. These are from Unreal. And okay, so the stories I'll be telling you about this project, one of them is called the Dreaded Espresso Machine and the Mind Melting Chair. I should have had an easier title for that one. So, the espresso machine. A little backstory. When I started working on this project, I was about a year into my career as a 3D artist. And I had worked on projects like Test Drive and Split Second. If you're not familiar with those, they're racing games. And one is more sim, the other is more arcadey, but they deal with recreating realistic objects. Things that exist, things that you can Google a lot of images for. And so they're easier to get inspiration for as far as how things look, how they age, how they're detailed. But with something like sci-fi, the tricky part is the fact that you cannot Google a different angle for that particular object that I was supposed to build. And sometimes when you're in a production pipeline, things have to move very quickly, and the concept team don't have time to do like super detailed production sketches for every object. So sometimes this is all you get. And I had to make that little machine you see over there. I think it was called a technical device or something like that, a generic title. And since I worked a lot on cars, I had a really tough time with this. I wasn't coming up with anything inspiring or interesting or actually worth presenting. And luckily for me, I didn't find the old files. That's very good for my ego. But it did get me thinking on what I was missing. How come I was having such a hard time with that little thing? I had built like really cool cars at that point. And these are kind of like the two generic shortcomings that a newbie like me, like a year into the industry, I consider that a newbie, someone who's new. And these are shortcomings that I had, but of course, I was not focusing on these. I was focusing on making shiny metal, like really clean normal maps, optimal geometry. I could not think about my very limited visual library, which this relates a lot to experience. This means you haven't made a lot of things, you haven't studied a lot of things, and then your knowledge base about the world around you is very small. So when you have to invent details and create believable things, it's going to be really difficult. And the second thing I was lacking, and this again is very generic, a lack of patience to understand and give meaning to the things I was making. And this means thinking about how that particular object will be used, what it's made of, how it functions, things like that. Like I said, I was focused on bevels and normal maps. I would not think about these things in the least. And I remember I produced a very mediocre result, and I brought it to our art director because he had to okay everything we were making at that point. And he looked at it and he said, well, you know, this thing doesn't make a lot of sense. What are you making here? This object you made is weird. And I just panicked and I said, I'm making an espresso machine. And I was hoping he would chuckle a little bit or, you know, just diffuse the situation because I was very embarrassed with my result. And to my surprise, he didn't laugh. He actually took it very serious. He said, well, if you're making an espresso machine, where do you put the coffee? Where's the water gonna go? Did you make that piece out of plastic? That's gonna melt. That's dumb. It shouldn't be out of plastic. And I realized then that he was showing me how to think about it, how to draw on the knowledge that I should have had of real-world objects, and how to implement that in sci-fi, which is something that didn't exist at that point. And this is what came out. Now, mind you, this is a 9-year-old asset, so it only holds up from a distance, but you know, it's definitely a lot more, okay, it's definitely a lot more than that white little thing. It actually took a lot of effort for me to bring it to that, clicky thingy, please, yes, again, okay. And now, the second story, and I'm gonna take a quick hydration break over here. This is called the mind-melting chair. This is again an issue I had with a prop I was making. It's this sci-fi chair over here. And again, the main issue I had with this is that I couldn't see the back of it. I had to invent whatever was behind the chair. And I had a really tough time with the parts at the bottom of the chair because they're kind of dark, they're kind of blocky. I didn't really know how to make sci-fi details at that point that were believable for this. And again, our art director just saved the day for me. And I came to him and I told him, I'm not coming up with anything interesting for this, so what can I do? I really don't know how to get inspired and find things to put in those places. And he showed me these concepts, which of course I had access to, and he said, well, why don't you put that big round thing at the bottom of the chair where the rotating piece is? And it kind of made my mind melt because I thought that's a giant reactor. I have a small chair. I can't just take something and put it there. That makes no sense to me. But then I realized this is sci-fi. Nobody's got that thing in their kitchen. They can't really tell me that the size and the specs don't match if I put it on the chair because there's no way, they don't know what it is. Nobody knows what this is, actually. So I can reuse parts and information from this as I will. And this was the final result. Again, 9-year-old asset. Okay, cool. So that was Entropia. And I don't think The Witcher needs a lot of introduction. It's one of the crown jewels of the gaming industry and of our portfolio. Very proud to have worked on this project. We did a lot of cool stuff for this, a lot of characters, some ships, houses, a lot of props, and you know, basically everybody on the team just dreamed about working on this project. And we're certainly very lucky that we did. Okay, and moving on. The stories for this project, no such things as small props and deadlines call for desperate measures. Now, like I said, a lot of the guys were working on characters and ships and houses, and I got this, which is a bunch of small props. Not the most glamorous task in the world. I think it's not going to be a surprise if I say I wasn't very jazzed to work on this. I was looking around and people were making very cool stuff. I was making these little bottles. And not only that, it actually took me a lot of time to make them. This is what came out. I actually had the genius idea of drawing those patterns by hand, which I regret a lot at that point because I couldn't believe how much time I was spending on these small things. I was thinking, man, nobody's gonna see these. They're gonna be under a table somewhere. I'm wasting so much time with them. And again, I was very unhappy with the time I was spending on them and the effort that went to things that I thought were gonna be invisible, basically. But then I got to play the game, and I realized these small little things that I considered meaningless were all over the place. So if I actually didn't invest enough time to make them interesting and cool, people would have saw my shitty artwork all over the game, constantly. So I'm glad I've actually put the effort into those leaves. And so it's kind of a cringy thing to say, there's no such thing as small props. But the thing is, everything you make for a game has a considerable contribution to the outlook of that game. And so it's very important you put the time in and the effort in and try to make it the best you can. So the next story, Deadline's Call for Desperate Measures. Now, another really cool prop that I got to work on with these two witches outlined in red. And somebody very talented in the character department did the sculpt in ZBrush for this. And I don't remember exactly for what reason, but there was a very small amount of time for the low poly UVs, bakes, textures. I think it was something like a day. And this task landed on me, and I went into full-on panic mode. Because that's, if you don't work in 3D production, that is an ungodly short amount of time for all those tasks. And this is what came out. They look pretty scary, yeah, even in Deadline, even in daylight, actually. But the scariest thing about them is actually the wireframe. Jesus, what a mess is that. So the reason I made that is because I was looking at all the things I had to do in that short amount of time, and I figured I can mess up the textures, I can ruin the bakes, it's gonna be the low poly. I have to make it really quickly somehow. And so I took the sculpts and I brought them into ZBrush and just decimated the shit out of them, and this is what came out. Now, granted, very usable geometry, it looks like hell, looks very dirty. I do not advocate doing this, but I got away with it because this is static geometry. They're not gonna be animated, they're not gonna move around, they're just gonna sit in place. So as long as you can UV them, you can texture them, and the bakes look pretty nice on them, you can get away with messy geometry like this. Again, if you are extremely desperate for time, don't do this on a regular basis. And just to give you an idea, this is what Caranthier looks like with the wireframe. Very clean, but you know, he needs to be animated, his skirt needs to flow in the wind and whatever. So the topology for him had to be a lot cleaner than for these witch shrines. So now, World of Tanks. And if you saw the presentation from last year, you saw my colleague talking about the houses and the environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tanks. Also, another hydration break. So, like I said, in the beginning of my career, I worked a lot on projects that involved recreating existing things, vehicles mostly. And I thought I had a pretty good idea of what it meant to create something that's very faithful to real life. But this project just showed me I had no idea what that meant. It was actually the first project where I heard of a historian feedback. Like the guys at Wargaming had a guy that was just surrounded by blueprints and old tank manuals, and he knew where everything was on these machines. So if there was like an asymmetrical weld under the fender of a tank, he knew about it, and he wanted you to make it. But you can see these things came out very lifelike, very accurate, and they look pretty good in our portfolio, so can't complain too much. Now, okay. So the only story I have for this project is the power of normal maps. Now, when I started out, I knew normal maps were very cool. I just didn't know how far you could actually push them and how much you could get out of them as far as the quality of your assets. So like I said, for this project, they wanted very detailed models. These are some of the high polys. We had to do the welding in ZBrush and add all the small rivets and basically everything that was there in real life. You had to have these in the high-res geometries of the tanks. But if they were really tough as far as the realism and accuracy of the objects went, they were even tougher when it came to optimizing the low poly. Now, if you guys haven't worked with low poly geometry, I'll go back a little bit and show you that every piece in the high res has some type of transition between them. Either it's a bevel, a weld, a channel, nothing is just stuck together. But when it came to the, okay, got a little trigger happy there. When it came to the low poly, we had to keep the poly count as low as possible. So that meant nothing could be extruded out of the main hole. All the pieces had to be intersected. And if you haven't done any normal map bakes, this type of situation is a complete nightmare. It's almost impossible to have clean bakes when you have all those pieces intersected with each other in all these weird ways. So we had to get creative, and this is what usually happens when you have intersecting geometry and you try to bake all those nice transitions from the high poly to the low poly. You get all these artifacts, and you can argue that I'm zoomed in very close to these pieces. From a distance, these are perfectly tolerable, they would never show up, but there are clients who will think this is completely unacceptable. So we had to figure out a way to bake these nice transitions very cleanly into our geometries. So the only solution I came up with was to duplicate my initial low poly and use booleans to connect all those intersecting pieces together into a unitary shell. And of course you have to clean that up a little bit because booleans are extremely messy. And from the initial low poly, I would use one of Maya's tools to transfer the normal orientation to this intermediary Boolean geometry so that their normal directions match, which means that if I bake a normal map on this, it will match the low poly where all these pieces are intersected. And this is the results we get. Now, because these were baked on those Booleans geometry where there's no intersections, the normal map transitions between the various pieces come out very clean, very nice, and it looks good. Okay, so that was the power of normal maps for World of Tanks. And thank you for having the patience to listen to my presentation. Okay,
so if we have questions, we have time for questions. Okay, no questions. Thank you.
Thank you.